2 weeks ago, my mom could not have swayed that way. 2 weeks ago, my 81-year-old mother fell and broke her hip in Dallas, Texas. And on Friday, April 20th, I boarded a plane to Dallas to be with my mom. Many of you know that I'm an only child. My parents were divorced when I was in high school. My father is deceased, and there's no other family around to help provide care for my mom. And you graciously allowed me to do that. So I want to thank you for supporting me in that decision. But not only did you allow me to care for her, you also taught me how to care for her. And let me explain that. My mom is fiercely independent. And when she called on Thursday to tell me that she had fallen, she said, "But don't worry about coming." I kid you not. She said, "Don't come. I've got it taken care of." And the truth of the matter is she does. She has people lined up to care for her, to take her to doctor's appointments. I mean, she is extremely well organized, and she just knows how to handle things. But I have been in many hospital rooms with you all and with your family members. And I know that in those circumstances, it takes someone to be there, to hear what the doctors say, and to help make those decisions. And so I went. And of course, when I walked into her hospital room, she said, "You didn't have to come." But a week later, or actually just a few days later, she said, "You knew that I would need you." And I said, "Yes." And I told her how I knew that, because I spend time in hospital rooms and see how important it is to have a family member there. So thank you. Thank you. I want to thank Bob Silver. He's not here this morning, but boy, he really stepped up to the plate. And we are so fortunate to have him in our midst. Bob Silver is the executive director of the Crisis Assistance Ministry here in Catawba County. And so we're very fortunate that he is a part of this community of faith. And I then also want to thank my husband, David. Many of you know him. It served as our former pastor here, and he covered our pastoral calls while I was gone. But thank you for your cards and your calls and your texts and your words of encouragement. It's been an interesting journey as the caretaking roles have switched. Many of you have been in that position before when the child becomes the parent. But it's good to be back. So I wanted you to know that there was a time in this 2-week period that I seriously considered flying back to North Carolina to be here for last Sunday, to be here for worship, and to be here for a short period of time. Because worship and preaching are extremely important to me. I consider them to be a sacred responsibility that God has called me to do. And so I do not take it lightly, or when I am gone, I don't take that time away lightly. And so one morning in Dallas, I was wrestling with this, about trying to decide if I would come back for a few days and then come back here to North Carolina, and then fly back to Dallas when my mom was discharged. And I knew that it was something that I seriously had to pray about. And so one morning, as I was having my quiet time with God, it was as if God just said very clearly to me, "Willis, you need to be in Dallas. You need to be here." Of course, I wrestle with God, and in that wrestling, I said, "But what about the sermon when I get back?" And God said, "If that is the main thing that you are concerned about, then I'm going to give you the sermon." And within about 30 seconds, I heard God clearly say, "Just tell people what you've experienced while you've been at home. And here are the 3 points. Boom, boom, boom." And that was it. And once I sort of had an idea of what I would share when I came home, then I could be at peace and be present for my mom. And sermons don't usually come that quick to me. Some staff people know that they really are a labor of love, and for one to be that clear was sort of a gift from God. And so I share now really lessons, really just from one Christian to another, what God is teaching your pastor, in hopes that what God is teaching me will be of help in your own spiritual journeys. And so here we go. 3 lessons that I learned from my trip home. And the first one is this: a few good ones. A few good ones. The flight from Charlotte to Dallas is 2.5 hours. I know that. I've made it many a time. Charlotte to Dallas, 2.5 hours. It is the perfect amount of time to watch one movie. And so even though I was really hurriedly packing on Thursday night to make a Friday morning flight, Thursday night to make a Friday morning flight, I was trying to figure out what I would need and trying to run around the house and get things ready. You know what it's like when you have to leave at the last minute. But I made sure that I took time to download a movie onto my Kindle because I was not going to sit in the plane for 2.5 hours and not have something to do. So the movie that I downloaded and watched on the flight was The Greatest Showman. The Greatest Showman. Anybody seen it here? The Greatest Show of hands. Not many people have seen it. It's interesting to me that not more people have seen this movie, but it is a great movie. It's a clean movie. It has a great message. It's a musical, so at times it's a bit cheesy. But if you just want to see a feel-good movie, I would recommend it. The Greatest Showman. It is about P.T. Barnum and the beginning of the Barnum and Bailey Circus. Now, Barnum is a working-class man struggling to become successful in his business ventures. He was born really into the poor class. And that was at a time when you really didn't move up different classes. You were either born into wealth or born into poverty, and there wasn't much social movement along the ladder, right? So he's constantly working to be successful in his business ventures. And then he finally strikes it rich with the circus. He does very well financially, but he still doesn't fit in with society's elite. He just keeps trying to be a part and to be accepted by this group of people that will not accept him. And he keeps trying to chase happiness. He wants to be praised by everyone, but he just can't seem to get it. And so he keeps getting lost and he's making mistakes. Even though he's done well financially, he still wants to be accepted by that upper class. And he loses sight of what's really important by chasing things that aren't. And so his wife comes to him, and in an attempt to sort of ground him, she says this. She says, Barnum, you don't need everyone to love you. Just a few good people. Isn't that great? You don't need everybody to love you. Just a few good people. And I realized on this trip home that I definitely have a few good people in my life. Because let's face it, if we're all honest, inside of each one of us, there is this deep desire to be liked and accepted. And the truth is that pastors are known for having this character trait. There are people that go into the ministries so they will be loved and accepted by large groups of people. But over the years in ministry, I've realized that I'm not in ministry to be liked. I'm in ministry to be faithful to God and to what God is calling me to do as I lead churches in the Western North Carolina Conference. And I don't need everybody to love me because I have a few good people that love me deeply. And I realized this when I was at home and faced with the responsibility and challenges of caring for my mom. So this quote got me thinking. As I watched the movie, this quote just struck me, and I got to thinking, well, who are the good people in my life? Well, of course, there's my mother, first and foremost, and then my longtime friends from childhood and from church who sort of surrounded me while I was there. They brought lunches to the hospital. They invited me over for dinner to relax in their homes. But as I reflected on this and really gave thanks to God for these few good people, I realized that those few good people are not just the ones in Texas. They aren't just my family or longtime friends. Those good ones are you. Are you? You are the good ones who have graced my life with friendship and support and challenges and inspiration. Paul, in his letter to the church at Philippi, said this. He said, I thank my God every time I remember you. In all my prayers for all of you, I always pray with joy because of your partnership in the gospel from the first day until now. Being confident of this, he who began a good work in you will be faithful to complete it in Jesus Christ. And so I thank you. I don't want another Sunday to go by that I don't thank you for being those good people in my life. Because I recognize that you are my tribe. And I'm going to love you hard. So I invite you to reflect. Who are the good people in your life? Are you nurturing those relationships? Are you investing in those relationships? Are you letting those people know that they are gifts in your life and that you are grateful for them? Because the truth is, you don't need everybody to love you. Just a few good people. Soft eyes. Soft eyes. Now you may be thinking when you saw that second point, you were like, soft eyes? What in the world is soft eyes? Well, a few days after surgery, after my mom had the hip replacement, it was time to make a decision whether she would do rehab in the hospital or go to a skilled nursing center. Lots of things to consider when you make that decision. The first one is like money. Like how much is Medicare going to pay and how much other resources are there? But really the main thing to consider was where could my mom get the best care? And so the nurse manager on Friday, she said, this will be a decision that you will have to make on Monday. Now, not much happens on a weekend in the hospital, as you know, and so I knew that Monday would be the day. It was sort of like this big buildup, right? We talked about it all weekend. And I had studied the papers, I had looked at different options, and I got there early on Monday morning, because, you know, doctors only come between 7 and 8 a.m. in the morning, and I was going to be ready for the parade of the medical team. And so early on Monday morning, at first a couple doctors came in to sort of weigh in, and as they talked, I could feel the anxiety rising. And I began to think, I've got to research this some more. And I was making mental notes. I was looking in my mind at a map of Dallas and how many skilled nursing centers I could go and visit before we had to make the final decision on Monday afternoon. I mean, I was planning my work and I was going to work my plan. But then I got still. And God said, look at this with soft eyes. No, God, I'm not looking at this with soft eyes. I'm making my plan. I'm making my list. I'm checking out the details. Look at this with soft eyes. Now you're probably thinking, what in the world are soft eyes? Well, see, just a couple weeks before, when David and I were at the beach after Easter, I had started to read this book called Grateful. It's written by a Christian author by the name of Diana Butler Bass, simply titled Grateful. I would recommend it. It will change your perspective on life and how God calls us to be people of gratitude and how everything is a gift in our lives. Well, in this book, Bass talks about being interviewed about another book that she had written. And the interviewer was a very spiritual woman. And she said to Bass, "You have soft eyes." And Bass said she panicked because she had no idea what the interviewer was talking about. And the interviewer could see her distress. And so the interviewer explained, to see with soft eyes is the capacity to see widely, to view the whole picture. And Bass nodded at the interviewer, and so the interview went on. But she says in the book that the minute she got back to her hotel room, she Googled soft eyes. It is a term that comes from the martial arts, and it refers to an awareness that reaches beyond the edge, to the periphery. Think of it like this. If a bright light is flashed in your eyes, what happens? Your eyes narrow, and you kick into fight or flight. But if the same bright light comes to someone with soft eyes, the person is relaxed and able to transcend the natural tendency to fight or flight. It's the ability to see the reality as sacred, to be open and receptive, to be able to take in the whole situation and be grateful. So there in the hospital room, I tried to see the situation with soft eyes. And as more people came in and presented more information, I just tried to relax and listen. Instead of jumping to conclusions and trying to figure out the next question that I should ask, I simply listened, not only to the medical team, but to my mom. And it really was a God thing in the way that everything worked out. And I have to be careful saying that, because do you remember what the last sermon was that I preached before I left town? About the Christian cliche, everything happens for a reason? Yeah, I had to be real careful about saying that. I don't believe everything happens for a reason, but there is a reason in everything. And so as the days played out and progressed, I could see that it was the best decision that we made. A decision that was made with soft eyes rather than with a narrow, controlling vision. Paul, again speaking to the church at Philippi, he says, do not be, now let's see if you remember your Bible, do not be anxious about anything. But in every situation, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your request to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Jesus Christ. So I invite you, the next time you find yourself in a stressful situation and more information is being thrown at you than you can digest, remember to look at it through soft eyes, to see the larger picture, and to acknowledge that there is more than you can see than in the moment. And finally, the third lesson that I learned from my trip home is that there are two unchanging things. Two unchanging things. It was just a week ago, that I walked into my home church, Lovers Lane United Methodist Church. I went to worship in the church where I grew up, and the church is called Lovers Lane United Methodist Church. It is okay to laugh at that. I'm surprised that I don't see more smile. I mean, the name of the church is Lovers Lane. Like, when I hear that, even as I say it, you know what comes to my mind is like a car with two teenagers. Like Lovers Lane United Methodist Church. So, Lovers Lane, it was named that because that was the street that it was the original building is on. Well, the church has since moved. They moved to a larger campus, and so now it's really sort of odd because it's Lovers Lane United Methodist Church, but it's not on Lovers Lane anymore. So, but I was returning home after 25 years to my faith family. And do you know what had happened? Everything had changed. Everything had changed. I could barely find the front door of the sanctuary because a welcome center had been added to the front of the building. But fortunately, there was a door, and over the door there was a sign that said, "Welcome," which did make it easy for me to realize that this was the door that I was supposed to go in. And once I walked in, a friendly woman greeted me and asked me if she could help me find my way. And I said, "Oh no, I grew up here. I can find my way to the sanctuary," which was a lie because I could barely find which door to go in, right? And then all around me were these beverage stations with coffee and water and lemonade. I did finally find the sanctuary, and the first thing that I noticed was that before each there are two doors. The sanctuary is very similar to this. It's more modern, but it has two aisles. And so there's two doors, just like we have two doors. And by each door, there were signs that said, please, only bottled water in the sanctuary. I was like, bottled water? My mom didn't even let us chew gum. And now they're letting people bring in bottled water? I mean, but then I realized, see, they had these hospitality stations with coffee and lemonade because they wanted people to feel at home and to feel welcome. And yet they wanted to respect the reverence of the sanctuary, and so they simply sort of made what I'm guessing is sort of a middle-of-the-road kind of opportunity. Please don't bring coffee and lemonade, but you can bring a bottle of water in. And I thought, that's a nice middle ground. I knew then that things had changed. But I knew they had changed even more when I finally walked into the sanctuary. And again, like I told you, the sanctuary is similar to ours, two aisles. And so I walked in one of the aisles. And the next thing I noticed, there in the middle section was this huge sound booth. And I thought, where did that come from? Where did the pews go? I used to know the people that sat in those pews, and now there's no more pews. But then it dawned on me, that sound booth was placed in the exact position where the sound booth was set up in this sanctuary for the cantata 3 years ago. Do you remember the beautiful sounds of that cantata? And it wasn't just because of the choir, it was because of the sound system that was set up that took up about 4 or 5 rows out of that middle section. And I realized that as important it was for us to have good sound at the cantata, it was important for my home church to have good sound so that people could hear the gospel of Christ clearly. So I have now freaked out about the water bottle and the sound booth. I finally make it to my pew. Did you hear that? My pew. Because even pastors like to sit where they have always used to sit. I noticed that the pew cushions had changed colors. That troubled me too, because the pew cushions used to be multicolored, which I thought was so cool, right? And now they're all the same color, which to me is so boring. But even more surprising than the color of the pew cushions was the fact that when I looked at the chancel area, there was an electronic keyboard surrounded by this casually dressed choir, very informal. And I thought, an electronic keyboard, what's next? Drums? I mean, I just, what else is going to surprise me here? See, you have to understand that my home church is known for their excellent music program. It is a sanctuary that seats 900, and they have a 50-member chancel choir. And so for me to walk in and see an electronic keyboard with these informally, I'm talking jeans and casual dress, it was quite a shock. But then I looked at my worship bulletin and I realized who it was. See, about 10, 15 years ago, my home church welcomed a worshiping community from Zimbabwe. And today was Confirmation Sunday. And so the new church members from the Zimbabwe congregation were joining at the traditional service. And so they were presenting the opening music for worship. And it was this festive, celebratory, upbeat music. And people were standing in the pews, swaying back and forth. It was more than just leaning on the everlasting arms. I mean, they were just getting down and clapping. I have never heard clapping in my sanctuary before. I have never clapped my hands in my home sanctuary. But then when the opening music was finished, the senior pastor stood up and he said this. He said, it's taken us 15 years to get comfortable with this type of music in our sanctuary. And everybody laughed and clapped again. What had happened to my church? It had changed. But then it came time for the sermon, and the pastor began to preach. And on this particular Sunday, they were celebrating his 20th anniversary at that church. And his sermon was about all that they had accomplished together as a congregation in the past 20 years. And in it, he told a story about a man who had written him a letter. And in this letter, the man, his name was Ken told the pastor how much he enjoyed his sermons and how he enjoyed the music and that he listened to worship every week on the radio. And the reason that he listened on the radio is that he was in prison. Well, the pastor went to visit him the next week, and they kept up communication with letters and calls. And after a few months, Ken told the pastor that he wanted to join the church. And so over the radio waves one morning, the pastor asked Ken the questions of membership. And then the pastor turned to the congregation and asked the congregation if they would welcome Ken into the life and ministry of that church. And over the radio, in that prison cell, Ken heard the thunderous applause of the congregation. And from that, the church began a prison ministry that has reached over 8,000 people for Christ. A few years later, Ken was released from prison, and his first Sunday to attend church was Easter Sunday. And with Ken's permission, the pastor introduced Ken to the congregation. And on that Easter Sunday, the congregation stood and gave him another round of applause. As the pastor preached, I realized that two things had not changed: grace and forgiveness. Grace and forgiveness. Because the same grace and forgiveness that was offered to Ken is the same grace and forgiveness that was offered to me. As an insecure teenager trying to find my way, with an alcoholic father and a mother who was trying to simply make ends meet, grace and forgiveness is what my home church gave me, and it is what I am rooted in as your pastor. And as I realized listening to that sermon, I began to notice the things that had not changed in the sanctuary. I noticed the things that had stayed the same. One was the baptismal font, where grace was offered to me without price and freely given to each one of us who have been called out of these waters. This had not changed. The other thing that had not changed was the communion table, where wine and bread were offered to me freely, where forgiveness was given to everyone who came forward. There were a few other things that had not changed. The altar rail where I knelt for confirmation had not changed. And the place in the aisle where I firmly felt God's hand upon me, calling me into ministry, had not changed. You see, those things will never change because they are rooted in grace and forgiveness. This is what I learned when I went home. I learned that I'm a person that doesn't like change. I don't like change. Who does? It would have been so nice to walk into my church and have everything look the way that it looked 20 years ago. And I would have walked in and my heart would have been warmed and I would have walked down Nostalgia Lane and it just would have been a nice Sunday morning. But if my home church had not changed, would they have reached out to the prisoners? If my home church had not changed, would they be welcoming the congregation from Zimbabwe? If my home church had not changed, would they have grown in their children and youth ministries? If my home church had not changed and made space for hospitality areas so that the stranger and the guest would feel welcome? I'm proud that my home church chose to be faithful to what God was calling them to be, even though it meant change. Because the church recognized that continue to share the two things that don't change, grace and forgiveness, means that sometimes temporal things may have to change. Temporal things like pew cushions and sound booths and music and drinks. Our vision, our mission that God is calling us to is to love all people into a relationship with Jesus Christ. And in order to do that, there will be changes. There will be changes in worship times. There will be changes in the sanctuary. There will be changes in the way that we welcome guests. There will be changes in the way that we relate to one another. But let me tell you about the two things that will never change. This font and the grace that is offered to every person who dips their hand into this living spiritual water will never change. And this table, where we all are welcome to receive the forgiveness of Jesus Christ, guest and member, stranger and friend, grace and forgiveness. The forgiveness that we are about to experience right now as we come to this table. In the midst of times that are always changing, two things remain the same: grace and forgiveness. And so I invite us to come now and experience the forgiveness of Christ that is offered at his communion table.